All right. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. In today's episode, Sona and I will be discussing Disclaimer, the new Apple TV Plus series from Alfonso Cuaron. Very famous filmmaker. This is his first English language TV show. This is the first thing he's done since winning the Academy Award for Roma. And his previous film, Gravity, he also won the Academy Award for Gravity. And some of the films he's made, either huge hits in their day, for example, really the pivot point for the Harry Potter films, the third one, which really made the series much more mature. A huge success for him, of course, and probably the most well-regarded of the Harry Potter films. And then Children of Men, which he followed up with, which was a big flop, but now is considered a classic of the era. And his Spanish language films, of course, as well. Roma and Y tu mamá también, another hugely influential and successful film, which is probably 20 years old at this point or more. So had a really interesting career. So I was very curious to see this. I've pretty much liked all of his films up until this point. So before we get into it, I think we need to step through it because this is very intriguing from scene to scene, even sometimes. But before we get into all of that, I had a few recommendations for you, Sona. I have some comedies to recommend to you. I've never recommended comedies on the show, but I have 3 different comedies that I'd recommend.
Let's hear it.
All right. Number 1, I would recommend The English Teacher on Hulu. Have you watched this?
I have heard such good things about that. I don't know anything about it, but I've heard good things.
This is this comedian. I have not seen him in anything before, but I think this is a big breakthrough for him. As is often the case, they develop these shows around these characters. And he plays a gay English teacher who teaches in Austin. So it's very interesting that Austin's like very progressive, but yet it's in Texas. So there's a lot of conservative people around. Anyway, this is just a setup for basically a workplace comedy. It's very much feels like traditional TV, by the way. Short episodes, 22 minutes long, just like you would expect on network TV. Incredibly foul-mouthed, though, so there's no way this is showing up on primetime television. And Sona, I watch comedies, like we've talked about Abbott Elementary here on the podcast before, and that is my usual experience of watching a sitcom where I don't even really laugh out loud. I just kind of nod my head and say, oh, that's cute, that's funny. I watched the show when I started watching it. I was watching it by myself, and I would laugh out loud hysterically multiple times per episode. This is incredibly politically incorrect. They make fun of everybody. They make fun of the LGBT committee at the school that he's on, which has only 4 kids in it, and somehow they keep banning everything from being done at the school. They make fun of like the right wingers that try to start a gun club inside the school. They make fun of everybody, and it's merciless and it's absolutely hilarious. I said I started watching this by myself because as soon as I saw the first 2 or 3 episodes, I had binged it just recently. I mentioned it to my wife, and then she was down the shore with her family visiting, and they started watching this and like, oh man, I don't know how this is going to go over with them. They were like, Victor, that show is so funny. And then we recommended it to like our social circle of like what we were at like a soccer match. All of our friend group has watched it, and they're like, oh my God, that show is so funny. It's got a lot of critical buzz, but I don't think its ratings are very strong. I don't know a single person who hasn't watched this show and like now has embraced it as a weekly watch. So it is hysterically funny. Really, really funny.
It sounds fantastic. Sorry if I missed it, but how do I watch this?
It's on Hulu or Disney
okay.
Plus.
Gotcha,
it's on Disney Plus, believe it or not. Wait to watch this show. You can watch it on Disney Plus. Wait till you see this show. You'll be flabbergasted. But watch Disney Plus, Hulu. It's available there. So and it's on FX. It's FX on Hulu. I don't even understand. I don't know which one of these things are actually on FX. So some of these might be on FX. And by the way, if they're on FX, they're also available on the ABC Now app. I don't know. I don't know how any of this stuff works. I think basically through one of those things I just described, everybody can watch this.
Gotcha.
So it's probably pretty easy to get to. I would assume most people are either watching this with Disney or Hulu. All right. Second thing I'd recommend, another comedy, Sona, is Colin from Accounts. Have you heard of this show?
Yes. I don't know anything about it, but I have heard it's really good.
I've only seen season 1. Season 2 just premiered on Paramount Plus. And this is an Australian sitcom. It's about this older man who, I guess this is not a spoiler because you find it out within the first episode, who had testicular cancer and is in recovery. And because of that, he basically has not really dated seriously because he doesn't know how this is all going to shake out. And he meets this younger woman who flashes her boob to him in traffic when he lets her cross. And she just spontaneously, she's actually going through a breakup and she's kind of a mess. She's training to be a doctor. And she literally flashes her boob to him at a crosswalk. And he accidentally runs over a dog.
Oh my gosh.
This is the setup of the show. the dog is injured and they can't find its owner, but it survives. The dog does not die. And basically, these two people are now thrown together and trying to solve the problems with this dog. And it's this situation of how they tenuously begin this relationship that becomes really, I think you would like this, Sona, because it really feels like it's going to be platonic at first because he has his walls up. She has her walls up because of this breakup. She's also kind of a mess. She's like dating a lot of people because she's in the midst of, having this a single life all of a sudden. And they have the cultural differences of him being much older than her, about 20 years older than her. So there's all these things. And it really just starts off as this really charming friendship that develops. But it's going to become romantic eventually. But it is a lot of fun throughout and also very funny. When you see the first two episodes, you kind of you think you know where the show's going. And then they introduce like this extended friend group. And her mother is such an utter monster. Like she does not see herself that way, but such a monstrous character, hilariously monstrous character. And it's so she, it kind of elevates itself from episode to episode. You kind of think, like, oh, I know what kind of sitcom this is going to be, and then it kind of shifts again by adding these new characters, and it's really good, very good.
And again, sorry if I missed it. How do I watch this one? Oh, Paramount Plus.
It's on Paramount Plus. I think season 1 might be available on some of the fast streamers as well, like maybe on Tubi or Pluto. Season 2 is premiered right now. It's exclusively on Paramount Plus. But I think I think season 1 is pretty easy to watch across these other options. Okay. And I've only seen season 1. I have not seen season 2, which just premiered like 2 weeks ago. I just haven't had a chance to catch up on it. But I have heard it's just as good as the first season. All right, the third one is probably the most popular of all of these, and most people have probably seen this. Me and my wife just started watching this. There's just 2 days ago, and we've already binged through half of it. Again, very short episode. I already
know what you're going to say.
You know what I'm going to say? We're halfway through it, and we just started watching it. Nobody wants this. Nobody wants this, yeah. So have you watched this?
I did. I binged it last weekend.
Yes, this is so much fun. I have to say that about halfway into the season now, I am a little less into it than I was at the very beginning. It gets into the whole part of the rom-com.
Yes.
For me, not only is it just you have the traditional, like, now we got to throw these roadblocks in, which is always a tedious part of the rom-com thing for me. And it's also the whole romantic aspect of it where she's proclaiming, I've never been in love with anyone before, and I've known you for 12 hours, but I know this is it. And I'm like, come on, give me a break. Like, that stuff makes me roll my eyes. But I'd say until they lean more heavily into that part of the show, man, the first few episodes of this show were so funny. Adam Brody and Kristen Bell have incredible chemistry with each other. They are on camera together for 10 seconds, and we are in love with them immediately. It was really great. Terrific.
And it's getting a season 2.
Oh, yes. I just heard about that. Yeah. So it's, I unfortunately, for me, that is not a turn on for this type of show, because it makes me think that, well, now they're going to have to drag this on. And, I honestly feel a little bit about that with Colin from Accounts. It would have been like a perfect 1-season show. But of course, now there's a season 2, which of course I would still watch because I like the chemistry between the leads. But, anyway. It all remains to be seen, but I do recommend all of those shows. They were very, very funny.
I would only add that, I really love that. I don't know the actress's name, but her character in Succession, where she was.
Yes. Loopy. Right? We looked her up too. Can't remember her first name.
So I'm really doing a disservice to her character in Succession, all of it. I don't remember her name here either. But I really do like her, and it was nice to see more of her. I think she's great.
She was on the most recent season of a show that I recommended here called The Big Door Prize.
Yes.
And once again, I could not remember her name when I shouted her out there when I recommended the current season. And she is very different from her Succession performance there, and very different from her performance here as well. She just comes into that show as like a total breath of fresh air. Every time she's on screen, she's just like lights up the screen. And I was like, oh, what? And I still, unfortunately, forget her name. But she is terrific. And I will promise to keep my eye on her, whether I remember her name or not from this point on.
And, it turned out, and you can kind of see in part of the scenes, that she was very, very heavily pregnant when she was filming this.
Oh my God, I missed that. Yes.
Yeah. Now that I knew it before I started watching it. So now that you'll see it.
I guess they've been hiding that in the way they shoot her, because I have not noticed it.
Yeah.
Not as bad as, remember Moonlighting, when Sybil Shepherd was extremely pregnant and she would just have like a pillow in front of her stomach the whole entire time. Like that, probably a little more subtle than that.
That was the era of it. Everybody was always taking out the garbage or carrying a laundry basket or whatever they needed to do. Yeah.
But now we're gonna have to keep an eye on her for that very reason. Okay, so let's talk about disclaimer, Sona.
Okay.
I was very curious to see this. I've downloaded the book, by the way, so I'm going to be reading this book. It's a very short book, surprisingly. This is based on a novel. It was her first novel. The author's name is Renee Knight. She was actually a BBC journalist and documentarian, so maybe there's a little autobiography in here. Very little, I would assume. And this is the first novel that she wrote probably about 7 years ago at this point. And before we get into the plot breakdown, so as I mentioned before, this is quite a package. It's directed by Alfonso Cuaron. He wrote all of the scripts, so he's the exclusive writer on this. It is shot, beautifully shot, incredibly shot by Emmanuel Lubezki, who won multiple Cinematography Academy Awards for working with Cuaron, like Gravity, for example, won. And his backup cinematographer, because it's split between two. I guess there was so much photography to do in so many locations. They have two cinematographers. So his backup cinematographer is Bruno Del Bonell, who is the cinematographer for Wes Anderson. So the pedigree here is incredible. And the music, by the way, is the first score by Phineas O'Connell, who's better known as just Phineas, who is Billie Eilish's brother and producer. So this is quite a star-studded and impressive package in front of the screen and behind. So anyway, for all those reasons, I was very curious. It had also played as like a 4.5-hour movie at the Venice Film Festival. And this is the other thing that intrigued me. It got mostly rave reviews, and a subset of the reviews were extremely negative. And by the way, that was the reaction to the book as well, because I think some people are just putting it out there for people who are not as intrigued at the beginning of this series, that there is something that happens very late in the story that some people, literally, some of the reviews are like, I was shaken for days, for weeks after reading this book. And some people are like, something happens very late in the thing, and I wanted to throw the book into the garbage.
Wow.
So that's what we have to look forward to here on the show.
Intriguing.
So I was intrigued. Exactly that. And I've avoided all spoilers for this very reason. I do have the book. I think I want to cover it here on the podcast. So I feel like I don't want to spoil anything at all. So maybe, believe it or not, just next week, we get 2 more episodes of the show. So we'll be more than halfway through the show in just 2 weeks. And that's when I probably will begin reading the book and make, if I start bumping up against spoilers, I'll probably immediately, maybe read the first quarter or the first third so that I can get to the end at around the same time the show does and get the full impact. Because oftentimes when there are these kind of shock twists in a story, I'll be like, I hated that. So I could very well be the person who hates this at the end. So it remains to be seen. But I'm intrigued. That's part of the reason I'm curious. So what did you think of these 2 episodes?
Okay, so I feel like we generally do a very good job of not really discussing what we're watching until we're actually talking to each other here. This one, as you are aware, by 2/3 of the way through the first episode, I think I texted you, WTF is going on here?
Yes.
Because I just was so confused at who I was seeing and when. And you had already watched both episodes, so you were able to just give me a little bit of a spoiler as to what it was, because I just became very distracted with trying to figure that out. And then I wasn't paying enough attention to the substance because I thought I had figured out that I was seeing a young version of Kevin Kline and his wife, and then it wasn't. And I think that kind of thing can be clever and interesting. Here, I just found it a little bit distracting. I think sometimes the big reveal is like, dun, dun, dun. What you thought you were seeing wasn't what you were actually seeing.
Exactly.
But here, I was more just left a little bit confused by it. So I'm not sure if it was the most effective technique for me personally. Maybe it had a bigger payoff for other people, though. I did enjoy what I was seeing. I was interested in it, but I was a little bit distracted by the framework. I also, as far as the way this is presented, I don't know how I feel about this narrator. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, which narrator are you talking about? Because that's what I'm curious about as well.
The one that is talking to the Cate Blanchett character by using you. She refers to her as, you don't think this, you don't know that.
Yes.
I don't care for that right now. Maybe I'll grow to appreciate it. But right now, I find it disconcerting.
See, this is why I wanted to actually begin, maybe have this as a primer for folks to watch the show. It use this conversation as a jumping off point if you struggled with it at all.
I struggled.
And I did too. But that's so this is where I want to kind of set that context. I just watched the first episode. I had exactly the same issues that you had in watching it. I had the same confusions that you had, but I was patient about it because I assumed that it would explain itself to me over time, which doesn't always happen, by the way. I think that, and this is me just presupposing here, I think that this is going to be, and this is the difference between TV and a movie. I really do think, even when you see how episode 1 and episode 2 basically just match up on the exact same shot, I think this is going to be basically a 4.5-hour movie. And the reason I mention that is because in a movie, you can disorient the audience in the first 15 minutes and then kind of reorient them later because you're watching, the whole thing. You're not watching it in bits and pieces. And I do want to call that out because I think that it is confusing in episode 1. And then I had assumed everything that turns out to be true by the end of episode 1, although I had all the exact same confusion you had. At the beginning, I'm like, is this the Cate Blanchett character on the train in the opening shot? And then I'm like, no, it's not her. It must be the Kevin Kline character in a different era. And then it's just like, wait a second, it's not that long ago, right? So now, hold on a second, it can't be him because that would have been like the 1970s or 80s or something. But then Cuaron, who's making most of these decisions, is intentionally leaving things vague. Like, we don't really know from the way they dress. We don't see anybody with cell phones or anything like that. So it's very much intentionally allowing us to be like, whose story am I actually watching here? So all that I'm saying is that I think that that it's what, if you're frustrated by episode 1, definitely watch episode 1 and 2 together, because everything you're assuming in episode 1 is explicitly said to you by the characters actually speaking the words out loud by the end of episode 2. So Cuaron is, making it clear by the end of that period of time. But I also didn't want to put my thumb on the scale when you did start texting me to give you too many details to kind of crystallize what you were presupposing, because I think there's an intention to him confusing us here at the beginning. So I wonder if that's going to pay off, because it's pretty much explicitly laid out by the episode 2. Do you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, and to that point, I had only planned to watch a single episode. And then you said to me, are you watching episode 2? And I said, yes, because I have to get a grip on this. I
have to understand
know
what I just saw.
Watched. Like, I can't have a conversation with you based on this. So.
Right. I was very confused. I don't know we have 3 different timelines. Let's actually use that as a jumping off point for the conversation, and also to touch on where I think that thematically that confusion is there, and also talk about the narrator, because I think that's also part of this. And honestly, I hadn't thought about the thematics of this until I started taking notes for this conversation. And then that's what kind of crystallized what maybe is the intention here.
Okay. I also, let me just throw in one other technical thing, which I did mention to you by text. This idea of a present day Cate Blanchett and a prior Cate Blanchett. Mm-hmm. I just don't think that the time gap is significant enough in an adult's life to justify having a different actress when we have the technology we have to make somebody look a little bit younger. I understand when you're going from a teenager to an adult.
Right.
But here, when you're a fully grown person with what seems to be like a 6-year-old or so, right. Yes, you certainly do age. But I think if you saw a picture of me from 20 years ago, I wouldn't think you would say that looks like a completely different person than she is right now. So I think I also found that very disorienting as far as what's going on with the timelines.
To that point, we don't see the Cate Blanchett character in an alternate timeline until the very end of episode 1. And as soon as I saw her,
well, we see the pictures though, right? Didn't that come before the end? I can't remember now.
Yes, I think we did see the pictures before then, or some of them anyway. But even then, the way we see those pictures, we just see them in little snippets until we basically don't see.
There, though.
Yeah, but I mean, I couldn't see her well enough in the photographs myself.
You knew her. Okay, I'm going to push back. You knew her well enough to know that was the lady you saw at the end.
Oh, no, yes. No, I'm saying at the end of, I don't see the Cate Blanchett character in the younger one until the end of episode 1, I'm saying, until the end of episode 1. And I knew it was the girl who was in, or the woman who was in the photographs from before. But the reason, what I was trying to say with where the photographs were a little bit vague was that in my mind, I immediately assumed these were photographs of Cate Blanchett when she was younger. Does that make sense? I mean, not because I recognized her face in the photographs, but because I'm like, that's the thing that would freak her out, right? Like that's the piece of evidence that is going to.
My brain did not go there.
I made that. I jumped to that assumption beforehand, and then I didn't really think about what you're talking about, which I completely agree about, is that the show, just to kind of add context to folks who haven't finished the first 2 episodes, the show basically has cast the younger Cate Blanchett character with this other actress, beautiful woman.
Yes.
Who I just looked her up out of curiosity after watching her here. She is the daughter of Greta Scacchi, beautiful actress as well. And Vincent D'Onofrio is the father. So an interesting, I don't see any Vincent D'Onofrio in her, but I do see Greta Scacchi. Once I knew.
Well, she's tall. I think she's tall.
Yes, true. But I think Greta Scacchi is tall also.
Oh, is she? Okay.
I could see it, Greta Scacchi's face in her face once I knew about this, but not beforehand. I would not have jumped to that conclusion. So they have gone with this other actress. I assume she have more larger scenes going forward, but we've only met her in a few scenes so far, and she seems to be giving a good performance. And she definitely is channeling. It's funny, like there's a certain way that Cate Blanchett stands, not only in this show, but she kind of has this generic stance, and she has her stance like on the beach with like one leg out and her hand like bent outwards, and it's like she's definitely imitating Cate Blanchett. But to your point, and I totally agree with this is supposed to be 20 years ago. Cate Blanchett was a famous actress 20 years ago. Yes, definitely famous actress 20 years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, like the Talented Mr. Ripley's 1999. So she's recognizable
Elizabeth,
to us.
I think was around
even earlier. Yes, you're right. Even earlier. So it's almost 30 years ago. For about 30 years we have seen this actress famously on screen. She's has aged beautifully, and she looks very similar to the way she did 30 years, even 30 years ago, even her 20s. Because I think we talked about this in text, but I think even in her 20s, when she's like an Elizabeth, there's something regal about her. Yes. She could have played 40 years old. Yes. When she was 25 years old. So now that she's 55 years old, but she looks like she's 40 years old. Like you said to me, you're like, they could have just cast her in both roles. I'm like, she probably could have been cast in both roles. I don't know if she has to be naked significantly. She probably does in that other role. Fair. So maybe she didn't want to be that naked at 55. I don't know. These are all things I don't know. But yeah, you could have de-aged her, for example, like you mentioned as well. So there were ways, or just lighting, right? You could have just used softer lighting to change her look. And I do agree that if it wasn't the series telling me when she's on screen, this is the Cate Blanchett character, I would not have just automatically been like, of course, she's playing a young Cate Blanchett, right? So especially, I think it's true. You have someone who has been famous for 30 years. We know exactly what she looks like.
Exactly. Yes.
But yes, it is a little bit of a distraction and an unnecessary one. I agree.
With all the intersecting timelines, you know what I mean? If it had been any one thing, it might have been
right.
Okay, I can go with it. But like throwing that in with the intersecting timelines, it feels like you're really purposefully trying to confuse me in this first 30 minutes, and I don't understand why.
Agreed. I'm pretty sure, unlike some of these other things, which I do think are devices for the themes of the film, I think this is just. They were casting. Like, how should we do this? They probably did discuss internally, well, should we just have her play younger? And then they came up with this decision. And maybe they shouldn't have, to your point, because there are already too many devices in this series. So then all of a sudden, you're already thinking, well, is this this person? And then when you get to the end, you're like, hold on a second. Is it? And we know from the reputation of the book that this is going to be a very twisty story. Then are you thinking like, oh, it's not really her either?
Okay, so maybe
that is going to be the reveal.
Maybe the reverse side of that. Maybe they thought going forward, it's going to make it easier for us to understand what timeline we're in because it's a different actress.
Well, I'll give the show credit for one thing is that they've added this device. There is this, an old timey device, which by the way, he likes this. He used this even in the Harry Potter film. I remember explicitly because it was such a weird technique where the iris is shutting down on the camera, like something that is not even an effect you would have, which also is confusing because that's like the cameras from the 1900s, right? Like if you're imitating Nosferatu, maybe in the upcoming Nosferatu movie, they'll have this technique. But not something you would expect in a movie that's set just 20 years ago. At least that is one indicator for us that every time the iris shuts down and the iris opens up, we are in this Past story. So, by the way, if you didn't pick up on that,
I didn't pick up on that.
So anybody out there, yeah. So if you're watching this for the first time, every time you see that iris effect shutting down and then opening it back up, we're going into the past or coming back from the past. So that's, and I'm pretty sure, Sona, to your point, there's an edit of this where they did not have that effect, and they were like, "This is way too confusing. This is way too confusing. We need a signifier to tell everybody when we are traveling through time." And by the way, so the series, very beginning of the series, opens up on that aperture opening up, and we see this young couple having sex on a train. The girl has, I said blue hair, you said red hair. Is it red?
I thought it was pink.
I don't remember. It's Run Lola Run coded for sure. What did you think about this scene? Cuaron loves to have sex scenes in his movies, which, like, I complain about the fact that like sex is no longer in movies. He always throws sex scenes into his movies. So good for him for that, at least.
It seemed very on the nose to have the train going through a tunnel.
Well, she was waiting. She waited. She wanted him to wait until they went into the tunnel, right? So. That is very funny, though. Yes, the train's going through the tunnel at the same time.
But hey, it caught my attention. So.
That's for sure. It grabs you right away. So it also tells you that the story is going to be a story about sex. So so don't be squeamish about it off the top. But they have a very sweet dynamic, and it is. This is like the X-rated. It's not that graphic. I did the R-rated, let's say, or more R-rated version of Before Sunset.
Yes.
Before Sunrise, right? I'm getting the wrong one right. This is what we wanted to happen during Before Sunrise.
But it wouldn't have that ache to it if it had.
Yes, so. Of course. This is what happened after she left, by the way, right? So that's the...
I was thinking about what I had seen after all of this. And I thought, why was this character even here? Did I need any of this? And then as I thought about what we know about the story so far, I think it was actually maybe to show, had she not had to leave this trip unexpectedly, everything would have been different.
I think that's what it is as well. And I also think it is. So I'm going to jump to the next part, and we can circle back to this because I think it's really important. If we think about this as a movie, and Cuaron, obviously primarily a filmmaker, when you have someone who writes television, they very much have a different setup. It's like, the pilot is teaching the audience how to watch the show, introduce you to the characters, set up the dynamics. And then you usually have like a punchline at the end of each episode that either resolves that episode and then you repeat it for the next one. That's like the sitcom recipe, or you have a hook to get you to the next episode, which is like more the drama setup, right? Mm-hmm. Unlike that, this feels more like a movie, where in a movie, you basically set up the themes of the film in the first scene. So to your point, I think the disorientation of being in time is important. I think the intention of having this wistful romp by these young people at the beginning, and then we don't know whose backstory we're seeing, is to make it a universal story. Like, this is about the mistakes you make in youth. And to your point, it is about those cross connections, that he would be alive right now if he had left with her, if she hadn't left, if he hadn't met that girl on the beach, had decided to go on the beach that day because he was bored, right?
Right.
So all these things that happen to us 20, 30, 40 years later are because of those things that happened to us by total coincidence when we were 20 years old. We're just supposed to be just like with this couple out of context. And I think that's intentional because it's trying to connect us to the universality of that.
Yeah, and there was a solid 5 minutes that I thought Kevin Kline was the guy on the train and married the pink-haired girl. And I thought, wow, what are the chances that they were in it for the long haul? I'm impressed.
Well, in the very first scene, I'm like, that is Cate Blanchett as a wild child before she became respectable journalist, right? And then to your point, then in the very next scene, we after we get introduced to Cate Blanchett, we get introduced to Kevin Kline. I'm like, no, that was Kevin Kline when he was young. I'm like, so that couldn't have been Cate Blanchett. So it is in that very way breaking your expectations from scene to scene. And once again, I think that's intentional. He could have laid this all out much more cleanly. And I think intentionally he is confusing us.
It has to have been intentional because otherwise some really poor editing choices.
He could have just moved the scenes. I mean, we open on the sex scene, right? He could have just moved that scene later on and it would have been much clearer intentionally. Okay, so once out of that initial confusing scene, we have Christiane Amanpour, the actual journalist, giving an award to Cate Blanchett's character. She plays Catherine Ravencroft. But very importantly, when she gives her the award, in this speech, in this gala, she says, these specific words, which I wrote down because I think this is very important. Once again, what does the film show us first? It says, beware of narrative and form, Sona. Their power can bring us closer to the truth, but they can also be a weapon with great power to manipulate. So I think this whole film is going to be about presenting a story to us and manipulating our expectations as we go forward. So I think that what we think we know about the story now will be completely different by the end. That's what I think. And even in the way, to that point, that the assumptions we made about those characters, he's showing these characters, and you are creating a narrative about them. And then you are subverting those expectations from scene to scene. And I think the show is going to do this holistically over the course of its run, my guess. So she's been a journalist for about 20 years. We find out in this like exposition dump / award ceremony. And about 20 years now, this particular event, this tragic event that we're going to witness over the course of this show happened 20 years ago. So once again, does that become the impetus for her career? We don't know yet. We'll see. And they also mentioned the fact that she's made a career of going after corruption and powerful people and like taking them down a peg. But of course, the framework for this show is that someone is going to do that to her. Another thing that Amanpour says at the end of that introductory statement is that the only way that we can be manipulated is because we have deeply held beliefs, and those beliefs are what are used as ways to manipulate us. So once again, I think all the thematics in the film are going to be laid out here at the onset. And in the book, by the way, I haven't read the book yet, but I do know that structurally we have one chapter which is written in this narrative voice that tells us Catherine's story. We have another narrator, which is the Kevin Kline chapter. So they go back and forth, chapter to chapter. And then inside of the novel, there is a novel within the novel, which is a novel she's reading that was left on her doorstep. Also structurally confusing, I would assume. And maybe I'm just realizing this now. I made this assumption earlier while I was watching the show, but I guess it just circled back to it at this moment, which is perhaps the flashback story we're seeing is the novel. That's a possible framing device.
Yeah, that had not occurred to me.
And then, of course, then we have to think about the novel is written by someone who couldn't possibly have known all the details. So once again, when we see the flashback sequences, is that the truth or is that one person's narration or a narrative about the truth?
Right.
That hasn't been expressed explicitly, but I wouldn't be surprised if that turns out to be the case. So yeah, so a lot of that context, hopefully that gets people past that introductory 10 or 15 minutes of the episode, which are admittedly confusing. Because then I think the plot gets pretty straightforward from the point of view of watching it as a thriller.
Yes.
We get introduced to the Kevin Kline character. Haven't seen Kevin Kline in a lead role in quite some time.
I actually just had this conversation with my husband this morning because he saw the little thumbnail of it on our TV home screen. And I said, hey, that's Kevin Kline, And then he said, whatever happened to Kevin Kline? He hasn't worked in forever. And then we had a big memory lane about a fish called Wanda and some other things. And then we ended up looking it up. And yes, he has been doing a little bit of stuff here and there, but nothing like it was, 20 years ago or so. Yeah,
he was a huge star at one point.
25 years ago. Yeah.
He was a huge star at one point. And
still married to Phoebe Cates, though. Have to love that for him.
I believe so. Yeah, they've been together for a very long time.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know if this is what he looks like, or the last time I saw him, which is probably 10 or 15 years ago in anything, he didn't look this old, which of course that's what happens after 10 years. But I do wonder if they are aging him up even more so.
I think a little bit, because when I was Googling to see if he and Phoebe Cates were still married, some pictures of them came up. And I mean, he is. I also asked how old he is. All of this was going through my head. I think he's about 75 years old.
Yes,
so there is that.
So, exactly. Good point.
But yeah, he does look a little scruffier here than he looked in the photos that came up just on a Google.
I mean, they describe him in the show as at one point someone says, oh, this man, he looked unhoused, or he looked at home.
Yes, unhoused, yes.
So yeah, he kind of has that look. And this is apparently 9 years after his wife has died, but he is still recovering from this. He's a total curmudgeon, it appears to be. He's completely disengaged from his university professorship, is wistfully thinking about when he still cared about being a teacher. That's when he should have retired, when he still cared about it. And he just seems to be fed up with most of the things in his life and is still pining for his wife, played by Joan Plowright. I assume she's going to be a much bigger part of this, considering they get her to play this role. Kevin Kline, I forgot to mention, of course, has an English accent in here. Strange that they cast somebody who's not British. Alfonso Cuaron, by the way, lives in London now. He's lived there for quite some time, and he made Children of Men in London, and he shot this in London. So maybe he just likes to shoot close to home. Maybe one of the appealing things about this making the show was that it was close to his house. But yeah, Kevin Kline is doing an accent, playing a Brit. His wife, we've only seen Joan Plowright in the role one time in this whole entire first 2 episodes. I assume she'll be more important, or she'll have more work to do over the course of the series. But basically, he starts to pine for her. He's getting rid of the last remaining things of hers, her shoes, her dresses. He keeps her cardigan sweater to wear around the house, very strangely, a way to commune with her, I guess. At one point, she had locked herself in her son's room and was writing a novel of some kind, or writing some memoir or whatever. And she didn't want him to read it, but he finds it now, not only after she died, but years after she died. So it's interesting that this is all happening. He reads it and he decides to self-publish it and use it as a grenade. He literally has this like hand motion that whenever he drops off the book, he does a little explosion with his hands. It's like he's going to detonate these grenades all over Catherine's life. And apparently whatever's in this book, which we don't know the details of yet, is very upsetting, because one of the first people he delivers it to is her. She gets it in the mail. She starts to read it. Importantly, there's a disclaimer. That's where this title of this series comes from, that says any resemblance to actual characters is completely intentional. So, and then she reads this book and it makes her vomit, and she tries to burn it, but it's too late because other people have already started to read it. We don't know the extent of everybody who else has gotten it, but we do know that her son, for example, has gotten it. And of course, by the end of episode 2, her husband has read it as well, or hasn't read it. Actually, I guess he's only seen the photographs that accompany it. So did you want to add anything else about the Kevin Kline character or this whole plot with the novel?
I don't have anything specific to add. I mean, I definitely enjoyed the way things unfolded in the second episode much more because I was able to understand it.
Right.
What we've seen so far is a really interesting premise, and definitely has my mind wondering exactly how things happened in Italy. And I have, my own theory of what happened, but it doesn't quite align with the vitriol and hate that Kevin Kline has, what I've concocted in my head. So I'm interested in seeing how this all plays out.
Maybe let's introduce a couple more characters, and then we can actually work our way backwards to what your supposition is as to the story. Because like you said, I've heard that this novel is so disturbing. And the story that I have in my mind, it doesn't seem to be that bad. I mean, it's bad for the context of the marriage, of course. But it doesn't seem like it would be the type of thing that would be like evil
deserving of this calculated plan so many years later. Yes.
Exactly. So I'm sure there's going to be way more context that we don't have yet. But let's introduce a couple more characters, which are very important before we move on. Sacha Baron Cohen plays her husband, whose name is Robert Ravenscroft, and it appears that he is very wealthy. We got to talk about the house they live in and her office as well. What a house, right? Which they downsized, by the way. We needed a smaller house.
Seriously.
And in London, no less. Oh, yeah. So he manages this nonprofit, which apparently manages his family's wealth. They come from money, but he is basically greenwashing. He even says it himself. Their money, and they just see it as a way to basically not pay taxes. They put their money in there and they want to get their checks. And he is, we see him a couple of times on the phone arguing with family members or trust members that basically want their cash. And he's trying to actually make this nonprofit do something, as well as not just being a tax haven for them. So that seems to be the contentiousness. I wouldn't be surprised if that develops. I just call it out now because I wouldn't be surprised if we find out maybe there's some shady accounting going on there. Maybe something else is going on. And we haven't seen, that shoe. I'm sure many shoes will drop. That might be one of them. And of course, he also has this 25-year-old son. So this whole thing happened about 20 years ago. We know that because of some of the math where the son was 5. This is 20 years later. He's 25, et cetera. So you could, the math is pretty explicit as to what happened in Italy in the past about 20 years ago. And the son is Nicholas. And I think some of the most touching moments here, there were 2 scenes that kind of touched me deeply in the show. And they're both mostly about this family dynamic rather than the thriller plot of this. And one was when the father went to visit the son And so context for that, the son has a contentious relationship with the mother. He feels like she never was a very warm mother. She feels, or maybe others feel, that she focused on her career too much when he was younger. We don't know if that's the case or not, or if that's some kind of guilt that a lot of parents internalize, obviously. She has decided that, like a little bit of tough love, he's been living in this luxurious house like a child, even though now he's in his 20s, and has finally had to strike out on his own because they've basically said, you have to move out and make your own way. And I assume he has a college education given his pedigree, but he's working at basically the London version of Best Buy, not prestigious. And he's living in basically a dorm room type situation. As a matter of fact, Sacha Baron Cohen, the dad, goes and visits him. And in this narration, which I did appreciate this narration. Maybe we'll circle back to that. You brought that up earlier, that I like that it gives us interiority to all these different characters. And I really was touched by what is said about him seeing his son and thinking about how he was so awkward at that age, very sympathetic towards him, but at the same time seeing like, this is how students live, but wait a second, he's not a student anymore. And, he's living kind of in this very squalid circumstance. And how disappointed that was the part that touched me when he said that he had never thought that he would be disappointed with what happened to his child, but he was really disappointed with his son here. Right. And I thought that was, I think it's a universal fear that I have. I mean, not explicitly, but I think we all have that fear as parents. We want to support our kids. We don't want to be disappointed by them in some way, right?
Of course, we want to see them succeed to the fullest extent that we think they can.
And I know people who have older children who say, and a lot of times you just have to live through it to improve. You get through it eventually. We all do. We all got through that period of time point in our lives, right? But it is interesting to see it from a parent point of view, which of course is the perspective I see it from now at this point. And then the other scene that touched me was at the very end, but we'll wait till we get to that one. All right, so let's talk about the narration here, because you said you bumped against that. We, as you mentioned earlier, we have no narration in the flashbacks. We have this omniscient narration when we are seeing the Ravencroft's stories. And then we have Kevin Kline himself narrating his own segment of the story. So what did you bump up against with all those narrations?
I guess the narration just isn't working for me as yet. I'm not willing to say it was a bad choice, in my opinion, quite yet. But right now, I find it's kind of like interrupting the flow and distracting me because, I started keeping track of they're referring to her as you here, but then other times it's a first person narration. And what's the difference? It kind of the way that the timelines distracted me in the first episode, where I was trying to figure out what are the rules for this. I find myself trying to figure out the rules for the narration, who's talking and why are they using the third person or the first person and that kind of thing. So it might become more interwoven into what the story is in the future. But right now it's distracting me. And so that's what I don't like about it, is that I'm finding it to take my attention away from the story, because I am interested in the story.
What if this story, the family dynamic story, is the novel?
I don't understand what you mean by that.
So we're seeing
the novel?
Right. So we're not seeing her actual life. We're seeing some revenge story played out only in the novel.
Yeah, that hadn't occurred to me when I was watching it. And it definitely would make this interesting. And then I need to think about what I'm seeing in connection with what could possibly be in the novel and whether that is consistent or inconsistent. You know what I mean? To either rule it out as a possibility or confirm it.
I did start to wonder about that because, once again, only in taking these notes, sometimes I may have revelations in revisiting these things, because one of the things I started saying was a distraction to me in the show was how beatific things were, right? Like the office is so beautiful. Everything is so opulent. Their apartment is so opulent. And by the way, those cinematographers I mentioned before, known for even the squalid apartments, for example, could look, are framed in a way where it's artistic, disgustingness, right? Like the cockroach on the countertop at Kevin Kline's house. But even then, the way that the house has been emptied out and the beautiful photography of the fox, by the way, there are foxes in London. I didn't realize there's tens of thousands of them, by the way. They run wild.
Yeah, I had that same question when I saw that fox run by. It's like, is that unusual to anyone except me?
Yeah, I had seen a movie. What was it called? There's a movie by Andrea Arnold where this woman, she sees somebody who assaulted her on CCTV. She monitors a CCTV. That's what her job is. And while she's tracking these cameras across London, she sees foxes multiple times. And I didn't really think about it. And then, of course, it's so prevalent. There's foxes across multiple episodes here. Well, we've only seen 2 of them. But even in the last episode, or the first episode, I forget which one it was, during the credits at the end, we hear the foxes like howling and growling on the soundtrack. So obviously that's a theme here. And I'm like, are there these many foxes in London? So I Googled it after I watched the show. And apparently there are tens of thousands of foxes that live in London. So
I have regularly seen tourists come to New York City and be fascinated with the squirrels. And I've always thought, like, it's a squirrel, dude. What's the big deal? So maybe right. That is the London equivalent of the American squirrel.
Or what is it? Raccoons in Montreal? One of the cities is completely infested with raccoons.
Well, that's a
people have
terrifying.
To have like special. They have to put special cans lids on their cans because the raccoons are very smart at opening them. And they have like raccoon prevention, and they nest in your chimneys and things like that.
I've heard of a one-off aggressive squirrel, but for the most part, they keep to themselves.
That's true. Squirrels are very skittish, so they don't really try to break into your house. They try to avoid that at all costs. If there's a person nearby, they go the other way. Even New York squirrels.
I do know someone who had a run-in with one in Madison Square Park, but that's neither here nor there.
It's because they get fed too much. That's the problem. If they think you have food, they'll approach you.
That is part of the problem, yeah.
So yeah, I do wonder about the fox theme. I have a feeling that we're going to continue to see it throughout the show. But yeah, so there's a very beatific view, especially of the story of the family. So I do wonder if, once again, this could be someone's narrative about it. So and once again, I hadn't even thought about that. Hadn't really thought about that until you texted me about the narration part of it. And then I was putting my own thoughts together as far as things I was concerned with. And, just to put a pin in all of that, one was the beauty of it is beautiful to look at, very lush, but then a little distracting in its lushness. Like even her office seems ridiculously opulent. And then some of the language, I thought that some of like when they're arguing with each other, the dialogue gets very clunky. And I'm like, well, maybe Cuaron is either using the dialogue from the book and it works better in the book than it does here, or maybe Cuaron, because of his language barrier. I mean, he speaks English pretty well at this point, but it's not his first language. Maybe he has a little awkwardness with that. And then I started thinking, maybe that's all intentional. Maybe this is someone writing something, someone who's not a professional writer writing dialogue, right? So I started to wonder. What
an interesting point. Yeah.
I started to wonder what aspects of the show we're seeing are real, and what of them are part of this narrative. And I think we're supposed to think about that as we're watching the show. So at that point, I think we can just go to the end and work our way back, because I want to know what you think the background story is, the mystery that's being resolved here. So this kind of culminates in not only the book, but this roll of photographs, which we have seen in the past. The younger son has been taking these pictures, and we've seen the pictures recreated in the flashbacks, like literally each one of the scenes, pictures we've seen in this roll. We haven't seen all of them yet, of course, not the sexually explicit ones, but we've seen the earlier ones. We see him with the girl with the different colored hair. We see him on the beach. And then, of course, we see him photograph Cate Blanchett's younger self on the beach with her son, which ends episode 1. And then we see beyond that. But then, of course, we see beyond that, what we've seen already, that there are all these sexually explicit photographs. So we assume that the Cate Blanchett character 20 years earlier has had a sexual relationship with this younger man. And that's what's going to play out. And of course, we found in the flashback itself that the Sacha Baron Cohen character, who's not even in the flashbacks, has had to go back to London, left her behind with her son. And then there's a whole blow up fight about it at the very end of the episode. But there's something very interesting, I thought, even in the narration there, where he's seeing this younger version of his wife. It does a few things. One is it makes him angry because he realizes this affair occurred that he didn't know about. Also, it arouses him because he's seeing her. And I thought that was very interesting, right? The idea of seeing your spouse in a completely different context and maybe in a more attractive context. So simultaneously, it attracts you to them again, but then it leans into your insecurity that like she was never like that with me, This is what I kind of enjoy about the show, that there are these kind of these little moments of revelation, even in these throwaway moments. But I also think that it gives you some insight into the psychology. And I thought that's why the ending of the episode 2 was so tragic, because these two people both have their own interior logic, and they're talking past each other. And I thought that was very tragic in a way. And I think it's a tragedy that we all suffer every day, basically. That's why it kind of worked for me the most. It also, he explicitly says, maybe in his own sympathy for his younger son, that he had always felt very sexually inept earlier in life. And he always had this inferiority complex with his wife, who he saw as more mature sexually and more.
And she is a little older. They made that point. Just
yes,
a couple
she's
of years,
a little bit older.
though.
And he probably was just a little bit of a wallflower himself. So he didn't have a lot of experience before he met her. And now, of course, this is all leaning directly into his own insecurities about the relationship itself, right?
Yes. Although I will say, and this is another thing that we briefly texted about, the scene where where he is confronting her, that starts inside the house, the beautiful, beautiful house, and then is taken right out to the sidewalk, to the driveway and the street. I had a difficult time with the tone at the dining table, because it almost seemed comedic to me at times. The whole dramatic, my family warned me about you, seemed a little bit over the top, and it was hard for me to take that seriously. I did think once they left the house, it took a different tone for me, which seemed like very emotional and dire, and I appreciated that. But the scene at the dining room table didn't really work for me.
I would say that in general, it worked for me. This is a curse that Sacha Baron Cohen will probably have for a lot of his life. I thought the scene inside the house, for the most part, worked well for me. But specifically, the line reading, you said, my family warned me about you. That specific line reading did make me laugh. And there was something in his tone where he did go a little Borat with it. And I think that is, he's going to have to live with that for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, that's just a limitation for him, perhaps.
I think if I said that to my husband in that tone of voice, he would look at me like, what on earth, lady?
But yeah, the whole scene where they run out into the street and she's like so desperate, it really was heartbreaking, because that's where I was saying that emotionally it really hit me.
Yes.
This is where it really works, that we have this dual narration or this interiority. There's very easy to see him as being this cold jerk who's not listening to her. But then we've already seen that he has this inferiority that has been like reignited by these photographs. And then it's very easy to see her as just like, well, she did all these terrible things, yada, yada, yada. She needs to take responsibility for it. But we also see that how she is always tending this marriage. She really does want to tend this marriage and have this as an anchor in her life. And the fact that they basically both want this marriage to work, they're talking past each other, was really touching to me. I thought it really worked well.
Yes. And also the idea of, 20 years is such a long time.
Yeah, exactly.
To me, if you ask me who I was at 20, I was at core, I guess I was the same, but in many ways I was a different person. So to have everything fall apart over something that happened 20 years ago, just really tragic to have things fall apart now over a decision you made 20 years ago.
That's why I felt it was so moving to me as well. It's very easy to be in the shoes of one person and say, come on, that was such a long time ago. And truly it was, right? Like from an outsider's perspective. But of course, we've all been in those circumstances. And it's very easy to say that. It's not so easy to feel like, were they so different a person? And like my son was there. And I remember that time very clearly.
And as a parent, you definitely feel like, well, where was the son?
Exactly. What was up with the kid at this point, right? What was he doing?
Yeah.
Was he just locked in the other room?
Yes.
He even says that. It's very cruelly in that, because he starts to spin out, which I think is interesting. You see all these dark fantasies spinning out. Like, was he in the next room? Did he hear you? Is that why you've been so cold with him all this time? So now, he's spinning out and becoming cruel. And of course, she has insecurities about being a cold mother. And all of a sudden, like that's being thrown in her face. So all of that, it just got so ugly so fast. It was really heartbreaking. Because once again, like you said, there is a cool, calm, collected version of that conversation that can be like, it was a long time ago. I apologize. There was reasons I never told you. Oh my God. And then when she says, well, he's dead, so he can't be like blackmailing me.
Yeah.
And he's like, you thought you got away with this.
Yeah.
And once again, he is probably hitting a nerve with her again, because to some extent, even though she says he never needs to know, maybe she did like, well, the only person who knows about this is out of the picture. All of that worked really, really well for me, because you see how all those themes are all colliding in that moment.
Yeah, I mean it's a saying, right? The only way to keep a secret is when one of the
Right.
people is dead. So,
Well,
yeah.
that's why I don't believe in conspiracy theories, by the way. I'll just throw that out there. Find it very funny where it's like, you could steal this election if 250,000 people were all in cahoots with each other and never said anything. Only 250,000 people. And I'm like, and Benjamin Franklin said the only way for three people to keep a secret is two of them are dead. That's what I believe. I'm like, if two people know something, it's one person too many.
I do agree with you that the final scene in the end for me, it was very emotional and very moving and very, I think, resonant of an argument any couple could have with, any number of different contexts of like these hurts that occur during the lifetime of you knowing each other and, can come to the surface at any time.
Yeah, and it's all being obviously dredged up by this book that's been written.
Yeah.
What do you think the story is? What's your theory?
Okay, so my theory is not a very novel one, because we see them at the beach,
right,
and the kid playing in the water. And I'm, so of course my brain goes to, he tried to save this kid from drowning in the water and did not survive, which is something that honestly happens almost every year here where we live, tragically. And she, had previously developed this affair with him, but, didn't want the headache of all that. So she just said, no, this was a stranger, a good Samaritan who, in the course of saving my son, he didn't survive, which again, something that happens all the time in this area.
Right.
Every year when swim season starts. But the conflict for me is even knowing that they had this affair beforehand. I mean, we're talking about a matter of days, right? This wasn't a trip that lasted months. I don't understand where this need for vengeance would come, even discovering that.
Right, exactly. That's where the question mark is for me as well. The specific one, the more explicit one, was the conversation she had with the mom. I'm more curious about how they have a relationship with each other at all, which has not been explained. But I would say exactly, there is a rapid fire sequence of images, I think towards the end of episode 1, where we see like there's like the camera is in the water, someone's frantically paddling. There's a bunch of people on the beach, like trying to rescue somebody. It all happens in like flashes. So I agree with what you're saying. I think that she had an affair with this boy. They spent this couple of days together. It all happened very quickly. The younger son was out in the water, almost drowned, was rescued by the older boy, and then he didn't survive. And then she has basically shut this whole thing up because all the questions as to like, why was he on the beach? And she was just decided at that moment to say, I didn't even know him. He just tried to rescue my son and didn't survive. And she left it at that. But then I'm very curious as the whole situation where in flashback, a separate flashback, by the way, which is confusing enough. I think this one's relatively clear. She meets Joan Plowright, who's already dying of cancer. She had died 9 years ago, according to Kevin Kline's narration. And then in her recollection of it, she says, oh, is it possible that she's still alive? Did she beat the cancer? And then she jumps back 10 years. So I guess this is like she's in the process of dying of cancer here. We see her with, her hair thinned out, probably going through chemo or recovering from chemo. But then their conversation's interesting because they know each other. So this isn't the first time they run into each other. They've had some conversation in the past. I assume it's the pictures, the camera made it home and the pictures got developed. And maybe that is how she tracked this woman down. That would be very strange back in the day to track somebody down based on photographs. Like, I don't know if that would be feasible.
Well, no, because I think
they know who she is because she was a witness at the drowning, right?
Yeah. Yeah. When he first opens the pictures, he says, I know who this woman is. I thought of her name every day for however many years. So I think they always knew of her, but they just didn't realize the significance of her in the son's life. Until
they saw the photographs. Yeah. So it's possible too, right? You could imagine they have the camera and they're so upset over his death that they don't develop the film, right? Because would you want to see that? Like, there'd be like salt in the wound at that moment. And then eventually saying like, well, we should develop the photographs and then be like, oh my God, it's that lady. That would be.
Yeah. I mean, kind of tying in a way, I don't know if it's purposeful. It took him so long to get rid of her clothes. And then when he finally does, the key is in the pocket, right? To the drawer that was always locked.
Exactly. Yeah. And then so the mom has obviously seen the pictures, but I guess she kept this all secret. So yeah, so I'm assuming that based on those photographs, his mom of the deceased boy has written this narrative about what happened.
Yes.
But maybe that is the incorrect supposition we're making here, right? That is my supposition at this point. I just want to make sure that we basically were on the same page. And even the whole Joan Plowright thing, now just talking this out with you, even the whole, like, how do they know each other? Now that we just talked it out, I think it makes perfect sense. That's probably exactly what happened. One more thing I want to mention in that particular conversation that I do think was interesting. When she says, you owe me because my son saved your son's life. And she says, I wish he hadn't. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure I even remember that line because I was thinking of like, my son is rotting under the ground while your son
Oh my God. Yes.
I was like, whoa.
That's exactly the pain, right? Exactly.
I mean, I think I would get that as a parent, right?
Oh no, but this is Kate Blanchett is saying, I wish he hadn't. So think about what that would represent.
That's crazy to me. I don't know.
I mean, you'd have to assume the son's a teenager at this point. Like how, I mean, I know teenagers can be really annoying. Don't get me wrong, but that's quite a leap to be like, I wish he wasn't around anymore. And maybe it's just something she said shamefully. And she may have a much worse relationship with her son than we even suppose at this point.
Yeah, maybe that goes towards what's going to unfold in the rest of the series, because now that you're saying it, I do remember that line and it struck me as insane.
Yeah, it was shocking, right? Like, could you imagine saying that? Well, I wish, like, this is so inconvenient for me. I wish that he hadn't even rescued him. I'm like, well, you know what the consequences of that action would be? It's pretty crazy. Yeah. And we get 2 more episodes this week. So we'll be more than halfway through. And I think right after I get through these 2 episodes, I'll start reading. And then as we discuss it throughout, I will kind of point out, oh, by the way, remember that thing you didn't like in episode 3? Actually, it's different in the book. I'll kind of point those things out.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting that they're doing 2 at a time, because I wonder if they're understanding that the viewer experience will be like, no one's going to come back after watching just one of these because it leaves you too disconcerted. You need a second one to give you a little more context. We'll see what's in these next 2.
That's why part of the reason I think that this is supposed to be watched as like a movie, because to your point, I think if they went week to week, episode 1 was a bad place to leave it, basically.
Too easy to stay away. Yeah.
Although, by the way, Apple TV almost always releases 2 episodes and then goes 1-to-1. It's more interesting to me. Not that they did 2. It's more interesting that they did 2 and then another 2. But to your point, maybe they're like, there's like a big hook in episode 4. And they're like, let's not make them wait. Because then I do think it goes week to week after that, which is a weird way to break it up. Speaking of, by the way, in parallel with this show, after this 2-week episode, I don't know if you saw the trailer for this. Did you see the trailer for Before?
Yes, and I thought it looked good, but I can't remember anything about it now. But I remember thinking it looked good.
It's very vague. I know more about it from the description of it, which I have once again, I'm always putting my pin into things or a pin into things that are potentially something we could watch. This is Billy Crystal, and the cast is almost all comedians, but this is not a comedic show at all. Billy Crystal is a psychiatrist who lost a child, one of his patients, early on, and now is haunted by this young boy who's one of his current patients, who seems to know something about what happened in the past. And he's trying to like fix what happened then with this relationship with this boy now. So anyway, rewatch the trailer with that context I just gave you to think about it a little bit. I think I'm very intrigued by it. And when I read it on paper, I was like, this is a very disturbing psychological thriller with basically cast with all comedians that are not doing comedic roles. I'm like, that sounds like a stunt, if anything. But the trailer for it was very intriguing. So maybe we'll watch that in parallel as we finish up this show. Do you have any spooky season movie watching that you plan to do?
Oh, gosh, I hadn't even thought about it yet. I guess it is upon us. No, I have no real plan. You?
Oh, I've been watching so many horror movies, but I'll save that for a separate episode. I don't know if there was anything you were particularly looking for. Did you ever watch Smile, by the way?
No, can I? I would love to.
Yeah, it should be out there.
I mean, you know when I say can I mean, can I watch it for free?
Yes. I think it's on
Amazon.
Obviously,
no one is stopping me.
No, you're not allowed.
Permission.
No. This isn't like the original Speak No Evil, where I'm like, don't watch this. Never watch it. No, it's definitely not. It's more like The Ring, which I think you would like. So
yeah, no, I think I would love it. I just am too cheap to pay for it any more than I'm already paying for, 1,000 different services.
It's definitely on Paramount Plus. So if you have Paramount Plus, watch it on there, or Showtime.
Yeah, I think I do because I have Showtime.
You have Showtime. Yeah. With Showtime, you automatically get Paramount Plus. So yeah, check it out there. Or now it's on Amazon Prime, so you can just watch it there also. But it is
sometimes
very
on Prime
creepy.
you have to pay for the movie, though. We're really getting into an aside here, but
No, this is Amazon. What do they call it? I don't know what they call it. Whatever the free streaming one is.
Okay.
Not Freevee, which is also Amazon Prime, but not Freevee. Freevee is free with ads, but it's just regular Amazon Prime. Yes, it should be streaming on regular Amazon Prime.
Okay, I'm going to look into it because I've been wanting to watch that for quite a while.
Well, the sequel's coming out this week. That's why I brought it up.
Oh my gosh!
I very much liked the. Well, here's your chance to see the first one with the second one about to come out. But I don't think the trailer for the second one looks good. But the first one's very good, so do check it out. It's a lot of fun, and it's very creepy, very creepy.
Great.
And I think it's right up your alley because I know you like The Ring. It's very much like The Ring or It Follows, very much in line with those type of films, and a huge success when it came out, massive success. All right, thank you so much.
Talk to you soon.